It was a Saturday morning in late October 1974, and three sisters walked into the cypress swamp at the edge of Harlan County, Louisiana, and never walked out. The search lasted 11 days. They found one thing, a single pale silk ribbon, still tied in a neat bow, snagged on a cypress knee about 30 yards from the trail. What they didn't find was everything else. No footprints past a certain point. No clothing. No voices calling back. And no explanation for why the ribbon was still tied, as if it had been placed there rather than lost. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The Calloway sisters, Margaret, who was 17, Ruth, who was 15, and the youngest, Delia, who had just turned 12, had been to that stretch of swamp before. Their grandmother's property backed right up to it. They knew the trail. They knew where the Blackwater got deep and where the cypress knees made footing treacherous. Margaret had been going there since she was 7 years old. There was nothing about that morning that should have ended the way it did. But something about this case has never added up. And in the 50 years since those three girls disappeared, the questions have only gotten harder to answer. Because the thing about a swamp, the thing that investigators, family members, and amateur researchers have all had to reckon with eventually, is that it doesn't give things up easily. It holds them. And sometimes, just sometimes, in ways that nobody fully understands, it gives things back. This is what we know about the morning of October 19th, 1974. The Calloway family had driven down from Baton Rouge the day before to spend the weekend at their grandmother's property, a small farmhouse on about 40 acres at the edge of what locals call the Graywater Flats. The flats were a low-lying stretch of cypress swamp and marsh that ran for roughly 8 miles along a tributary of the Atchafalaya Basin. It was not considered dangerous by anyone who lived near it. Local families had hunted and fished there for generations. Children played along its edges. The trail that ran along the northern boundary was well-worn and well-known. Their grandmother, Eleanor Calloway, a woman in her late 60s who had lived on that property for over 40 years, said the girls had asked to take a morning walk along the trail while the adults had coffee. She said they were cheerful. Margaret had a book tucked under her arm. Ruth had braided Delia's hair before breakfast, and the braid was still neat when they set out. Eleanor said she watched them from the kitchen window until they disappeared around the bend in the trail. She said they were laughing about something. She couldn't hear what. That was the last confirmed sighting of any of the three Calloway sisters. By noon, when they hadn't returned, Eleanor walked the trail herself, calling their names. She found nothing. She drove to the neighbor's house. The nearest telephone was about 1.5 miles away, and called the county sheriff's office just after 1 in the afternoon. Deputies arrived before 2 o'clock. By nightfall, a search party of roughly 30 people was moving through the Graywater Flats with flashlights and lanterns. The ribbon was found on the second day. It belonged to Delia. Her mother identified it immediately. A pale cream silk ribbon that had been in Delia's hair that morning, tied in a bow by her sister Ruth. It was found 31 yards from the main trail, attached to a cypress knee that rose about knee-height out of the shallow water. It was still tied, not snagged, not frayed, tied, as neatly as it had been in Delia's hair at breakfast. The search continued for 9 more days after that. Experienced trackers, dogs, airboats moving slowly through the shallower sections of marsh. Nothing else was found. No other clothing. No signs of struggle. No footprints leading away from the ribbon's location. The ground around that cypress knee was soft enough to hold an impression, and there were no impressions of any kind, not even from whatever hand had placed that ribbon there, because it had been placed. Everyone agreed on that. Eventually, the investigators, the trackers, the family, that ribbon had not simply fallen off a child's head and landed in a neat bough on a cypress knee in the middle of the swamp. Someone had tied it there. The question was when, and the question was who. The Harlan County Sheriff's Department officially classified the case as 3 missing persons within the first week. They did not classify it as a crime scene, which meant they did not preserve it the way a crime scene would have been preserved. The area around the ribbon was walked through by dozens of searchers before anyone thought to restrict access. Whatever physical evidence might have existed in that immediate area, footprints, fibers, anything at all, was compromised almost immediately. Sheriff Earl Dempsey, who led the initial investigation, gave a statement to the local paper about 2 weeks after the disappearance. He said, and this is worth noting carefully, that investigators believe the girls had likely wandered off the trail into the deeper marsh and become disoriented. He said the swamp could be deceptive, that even experienced locals had gotten turned around in certain sections of flats. He said the family had his deepest sympathies and that the case remained open. What he did not say, and what would not become known to the family for another 3 years, was that 2 members of his own search party had reported hearing something on the 4th night of the search, a sound described in their own handwritten notes as rhythmic humming, coming from the direction of the deep marsh. Both men noted it independently, in separate accounts written on the same evening. Neither account appeared in the official case file. The Calloway family learned about those notes in 1977, when a deputy named Thomas Ardoin, who had been part of the original search, contacted the family privately. He had been asked to retire early, he said. He wasn't sure why. But before he left, he had made copies of several documents he felt the family deserved to see. The humming accounts were among them. Margaret and Ruth and Delia's mother, a woman named Carol Calloway, drove to meet Thomas Ardoin at a diner in a town about 60 miles from Harlan County. She brought her husband, Warren. Ardoin was careful in how he spoke. He said he wasn't accusing anyone of anything. He said he just thought the family had a right to the full picture. He handed over the copies and left before they had finished their coffee. Carol Calloway kept those documents in a lockbox under her bed for the rest of her life. When she passed in 2009, her surviving relatives found the lockbox and spent the better part of a year trying to understand what they had. The humming notes were there. So it was something else, a single page, undated and signed, that appeared to have been torn from a larger report. It referenced a structure, a dry elevated space within the marsh, and a reference to the word accessed, though the sentence it belonged to was missing. What that page came from and what it was describing, no one has been able to determine. The original case file, when finally obtained by the family through a public records request in 2011, did not contain any document matching that page. It had never been filed, or it had been removed. The sheriff's department, now under entirely different leadership, said they had no record of any structure being discovered during the 1974 search. They said the page was likely unrelated to the case. The family did not accept that explanation, and frankly, looking at the evidence, it's difficult to understand why anyone would. At this point in the investigation, you are left with 2 very different pictures of what happened in October of 1974. The first is the official one. 3 girls who wandered into a swamp, became disoriented in the deep marsh, and were lost to the water and the terrain. Tragic, but not uncommon for that era in that region. The second picture is harder to look at directly. It involves sounds that were heard and not reported, documents that existed and then didn't, a structure that may or may not have been found, and a ribbon tied too neatly to have fallen there by accident. Which picture would you have believed if you had been sitting across from Thomas Ardoin in that diner? Let's go back to the swamp itself for a moment, because the geography matters more than most accounts of this case have acknowledged. The Graywater Flats, in 1974, cover an area of approximately 600 acres. About a third of that was passable on foot during dry months. Shallow marsh, cypress groves, natural levees of slightly higher ground. The rest was deep black water, some of it bottomless in practical terms, fed by the slow movement of water through the basin's root systems. You could stand on the edge of the passable section and look out at the deep marsh, and it would look, to an untrained eye, like the same terrain continuing indefinitely. The difference was imperceptible until you stepped into it. But there was something else about the flats that was not widely known outside the region, and that has become considerably more relevant in recent years. Beneath a significant section of the Graywater Flats, there's a limestone formation, part of the same geological layer that produces the cave systems found throughout the Florida Panhandle and coastal Louisiana. In most places, this formation is 50 or 60 feet below the surface. But in one section of the flats, it comes much closer to the top. In that section, the limestone has eroded in a particular way over thousands of years, creating what geologists call a dissolution pocket, essentially a hollow space beneath the surface, covered by a thin layer of sediment and root mat. In dry years, when the water table drops, these pockets can become accessible from above. The mat thins, cracks form, and in some cases the space beneath is large enough to walk into. Dry, enclosed, a chamber that the swamp has built around itself, hidden beneath the surface of the marsh. A geologist named Dr. Patricia Newell surveyed the Greywater Flats in 2019 as part of a wetland conservation study. She was not looking for anything related to the Calloway case. She was mapping limestone formations. What she found in the northeastern section of the flats was a dissolution pocket approximately 40 feet wide and 12 feet high at its tallest point, fully enclosed, accessible, she determined, through a narrow opening in the root mat that would have been at or near the surface in periods of low water. And within that pocket, preserved by the enclosed, humidity-controlled environment, were the remnants of what appeared to be human habitation. Animal bones, picked clean and stacked. A piece of fabric, deteriorated but identifiable as cotton. 3 small stones arranged in a deliberate pattern, the kind of pattern that doesn't occur naturally, and scratched into the limestone wall, in letters that were careful and deliberate, a single word: home. Dr. Newell contacted the Louisiana State Police and the Harlan County Sheriff's Department when she understood what she might have found. The state police sent a forensic team. The Sheriff's Department sent a representative. The family, the surviving members of the Calloway family, now scattered across 3 states, were not notified until 2 weeks after the site had been processed. What forensics found in that chamber has been released only partially. The family has received some information. The public record contains very little. What has been confirmed, through the family's attorney and through a brief statement from the Louisiana State Police, is this: the fabric found in the chamber was consistent in age with the early to mid-1970s. The arranged stones were placed with deliberate intent. DNA testing on organic material within the chamber. Hair, most likely, though the official language was biological trace material, returned results that the state police declined to detail publicly, citing the ongoing nature of the investigation. The case was officially reopened in 2020. As of the time this was recorded, it remains open. Here is where the story becomes something other than a mystery about 3 missing girls, and becomes a question about the nature of disappearance itself. The Calloway sisters were gone before anyone understood that a place to go existed. The dissolution pocket in the northeastern flats, what the family now simply calls a chamber, would have been accessible in the fall of 1974. That October had followed a summer of exceptionally low rainfall. The water table in the flats would have been lower than average. The root mat over the pocket would have thinned. Not enough for someone who knew it was there to find it, necessarily, but perhaps enough for someone who stumbled onto it. Someone small, someone light, someone who stepped onto the mat not knowing what was beneath it and found themselves dropping into a space that the swamp had kept secret for 10,000 years. Thomas Ardoin, the deputy who brought the family copies of those documents, passed away in 1994. He never gave a formal statement about what he believed happened to the Calloway girls, but his daughter, in an interview conducted for a local historical preservation project in 2018, said that her father had carried the case with him his entire life. She said he told her once, a few years before he died, that he believed the girls had been alive for some time after the official search ended. He couldn't explain how. He just said he believed it. He said the sounds on the 4th night had not been the kind of sounds you heard from a swamp in distress. He said they were the opposite of that. He said it sounded like someone who had found somewhere safe. The acoustic question, the question of the humming, has been addressed by researchers who work in a field called archaeoacoustics, which studies how sound behaves in enclosed geological spaces. Limestone chambers, it turns out, have extraordinary acoustic properties. Certain frequencies resonate and amplify within enclosed limestone spaces in ways that can project sound considerable distances through cracks and fissures in the rock. A person humming inside a limestone pocket beneath a swamp could, under the right atmospheric conditions, produce sound that seemed to come from multiple locations on the surface above. Diffused, directionless, the kind of sound that might be described by untrained observers as ghostly or inexplicable or coming from everywhere at once. The Greywater Flats have a reputation, if you ask the older residents of Harlan County. Not a supernatural reputation, exactly. More of a careful one. People who have fished those waters for decades will tell you, without much elaboration, that there are parts of flats where sound behaves strangely, where you'll hear something and turn toward it, and it won't be there, where the morning fog seems to carry noises from places they couldn't have originated, most of them attributed to the water, the wind, the acoustics of the cypress canopy. Most of them don't think much about it, but some of them, particularly those who have been on or near the flats in the hours before dawn, describe something more specific, a low rhythmic sound, not animal, not mechanical, something in a frequency that feels intentional. Several of the fishermen interviewed by Dr. Newell's team during the 2019 survey mentioned it independently, without prompting from each other. One man, who had been fishing the flats for 40 years, said he'd heard it since the late 70s. He said it was always in the same part of the marsh. He said he'd always assumed it was some kind of natural phenomenon. He said he'd never mentioned it to anyone before because he wasn't sure anyone would take him seriously. He pointed to the northeastern section of the flats, exactly where the chamber was found. Now, before you arrive at any conclusions, and it would be easy to arrive at them quickly here, let's be very careful about what we know and what we don't. What we know: 3 sisters disappeared in October 1974. 1 ribbon was found, placed with intention. 2 members of the search party heard humming and did not report it in the official file. Documents existed that were not included in the official record. A geological chamber was found in 2019 containing material consistent with the early 1970s. DNA results from that material have not been released publicly. The case was reopened in 2020 and remains open. What we don't know: what happened in the hours immediately after the ribbon was placed, whether the girls found the chamber intentionally or accidentally, how long they may have survived inside it, what the DNA results showed, why certain documents were excluded from the official case file in 1974, what the unsigned, undated page that Carol Calloway kept under her bed for 35 years was originally part of, whether the sounds heard in the flats over the past 5 decades are connected to the chamber's acoustics or simply to the natural behavior of the terrain. There's a version of the story that is purely geological and forensic. 3 girls fall through a thin root mat into an enclosed limestone space, survive for a period, leave evidence of their survival, and ultimately do not make it out. That version is painful in a specific, human way. It raises questions about whether a more thorough search in 1974, one that had not compromised the immediate area around the ribbon, might have found them in time. It raises questions about whether the sounds on the 4th night, if reported and acted on, might have changed the outcome. These are not comfortable questions. There is another version of this story that is harder to dismiss, but also harder to accept. That version involved the unsigned page, the reference to a structure, to something being accessed, and asked whether someone in 1974 found the chamber and made a decision about what to do with that information. That version involves a premature end to Thomas Ardoin's career and the deliberate exclusion of witness accounts from the official file. That version does not require conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It requires only the quieter and more common thing: people in authority choosing not to pursue answers because the answers were complicated or inconvenient or simply too hard to look at. It requires the kind of institutional silence that doesn't announce itself. It just settles in, like water finding a level, until it's the only thing left. The family has not been given the full forensic report from the 2019 examination of the chamber. Their attorney filed for access in 2021. The request was partially fulfilled. Some pages were redacted. They have been told, through legal channels, that the investigation is active and that releasing full details could compromise it. They have been told this for 5 years. The oldest living member of the Calloway family is a woman in her late 80s, a cousin who was 12 years old herself in the fall of 1974, about the same age as Delia. She lives in northern Louisiana now, not far from where the girls grew up. She has given one interview about the case to a regional newspaper in 2021, and in it she said something that has stayed with everyone who has followed this story closely. She said she didn't need to understand what happened. She had made her peace. She said, with not understanding. What she needed, what she had needed for 50 years, was for someone to say out loud that the official explanation had always been insufficient. That 3 girls do not simply vanish from a trail their family knew by heart without something being missed. And that missing something, she said, was not the girls' fault, and it was not the swamp's fault, and it was not the fault of time or water or terrain. Somewhere, in whatever documents remain sealed or unexamined or filed wrong, there is an explanation. She said she did not expect to see it, but she needed someone to say that it exists. There are questions this case leaves behind that have no clean answer. Not because the answers don't exist, but because the answers are somewhere that has not yet been opened. What the limestone chamber gave back, after 50 years, was evidence of survival. Evidence that 3 girls who walked into a swamp one October morning were resourceful enough and calm enough and together enough to make something out of the impossible situation they found themselves in. The stacked bones, the arranged stones, the words scratched into the wall. Those are not the marks of panic. Those are the marks of people who intended to be found, or at the very least, intended to leave something behind that said, "We were here. We existed. We made a place in the dark, and we called a home." Whether they were heard when they should have been heard is the question that the families of the missing always have to live with. Whether the sounds that drifted to fog over the Greywater Flats for decades after their disappearance were acoustics or memory or something science has not fully named yet, that is a question that belongs to the swamp, and the swamp has kept it for 50 years. Margaret Calloway would have been 67 years old this year. Ruth would have been 65. Delia would have been 62. They would have been grandmothers. Probably they would have had opinions about things. They would have remembered that morning walk, if any of them had lived to remember anything at all. The trail, the cypress knees, the fog burning off as the October sun came up over the flats. They would have remembered the ribbon in Delia's hair and Ruth's hands tying it. Small things. The kind of things that disappear first when we stop telling the stories. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. And the questions here have not been answered. Not by the Sheriff's Department that handled this case in 1974. Not by the state police who processed the chamber in 2019. Not by the 5 years of partial records and redacted pages, an ongoing investigation that has given the family fragments without ever giving them the whole. If you have followed similar cases, disappearances in rural areas, investigations that close too quickly, records that don't match, drop them in the comments. Not because patterns are the same as answers, but because the more clearly we can see how these things happen, the harder it becomes to look away from them. The Calloway family has been asking the same questions for 50 years. They deserve, at minimum, for more people to be asking them too.